It was Christmas Eve, and the world outside was a frozen wasteland. Snow piled high against the windows, sealing us in like prisoners of winter. The internet was down, the cable was out, and my phone was nothing more than a lifeless brick. I had come back to Japan to visit my family during the holidays, expecting warmth and nostalgia, but instead I was trapped in a house that felt like a relic from another time. Bored and irritable, I slumped on the tatami floor, scrolling through old photos out of sheer desperation. My grandpa, ever the stoic figure of tradition, watched me with an unimpressed glare. He was the embodiment of an era long past, raised in the shadow of samurai values and the rigid discipline of old Japan. Sensing my restlessness, he gave a deep sigh, the kind that made it clear he thought I was a disappointment. Without a word, he rose from his seat by the fire, his movements slow but deliberate. It was the kind of quiet authority that demanded attention. I barely looked up until he spoke. "You think the snow is your enemy?" he said, his voice gruff but laced with a faint challenge. "No, boy. Your enemy is the silence, and I'll teach you why." I had no idea what he meant, but as he reached for his pipe and settled in with a knowing gleam in his eye, I realized he was about to tell me one of his stories, one of those tales that left you wondering whether he was sharing a family legend or a personal secret too strange to believe. "Let me tell you a story, kid," Grandpa began, his voice low, the firelight casting flickering shadows on his face. "It's about a boy who thought he was just drawing cats, but what he really did was wake something terrible." He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "This happened a long time ago, in a tiny village in Japan, where a poor farmer and his wife lived with their many children. They were good folks, hard-working, but they struggled to make ends meet. Their youngest boy, though, he wasn't like the others, smart as a whip, but small and frail. No use for farm work, but clever enough to maybe become a priest. So they took him to the village temple and asked the old priest to take him in. The boy was clever, all right. Too clever. He learned everything quickly, but there was one thing he couldn't stop doing: drawing cats. He drew them on anything he could find, on scraps of paper, the priest's books, even the sacred screens in the temple. The priest warned him to stop. "Focus on your studies," he'd say, but the boy just couldn't help himself. It was like something was driving him to draw, over and over. Finally, one day, the priest had enough. He told the boy, "You'll never be a priest. You're meant for something else. But listen carefully. Remember this. Avoid large places at night. Stick to small ones." The boy didn't understand, but the old man's words left an uneasy feeling in his chest. He packed up his few belongings and left the temple, too scared to go home. As night fell, he remembered hearing about a big temple in the next village, 12 miles away. He decided to go there, thinking maybe the priests there would take him in. What he didn't know, Grandpa said, his voice dropping to a whisper, was that the big temple had been abandoned for years. Something evil had taken over. The priests had fled, and the villagers avoided it like the plague. But the boy didn't know. All he saw was the light shining from its windows. The boy knocked on the heavy wooden doors, but no one answered. He pushed them open, finding the place eerily silent. Inside, a single lamp flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the dusty floor. Cobwebs hung like curtains, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. But what caught the boy's eye were the screens, beautiful white screens just waiting to be painted. He couldn't resist. He ground some ink and began drawing. "Cats," Grandpa said, his voice growing darker, but not the playful kind. These were wild, feral things with sharp claws and glowing eyes. He drew them until the screens were alive with their menacing shapes. Exhausted, the boy was about to lay down to sleep when the priest's words echoed in his mind. Avoid large places at night. Suddenly uneasy, he looked around the massive hall, the shadows seeming to creep closer. He found a small cabinet in the corner, just big enough for him to crawl into. He slid the door shut and curled up, clutching his knees to his chest. That's when it began. He heard it first, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once, Grandpa said, leaning forward. Then came the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor, followed by a wet, slithering noise. The boy held his breath, too scared to move. Whatever it was in the temple, with him. The dragging grew louder, closer. Then came a terrible crash, a sound like the world splitting open. The boy covered his ears, trembling as the air filled with snarls, screeches, and the unmistakable sound of flesh tearing. It went on for hours, Grandpa whispered. The boy thought he'd lose his mind. Then just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence. Dead silence. When the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks of the cabinet, the boy finally mustered the courage to slide the door open. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. The floor was drenched in blood, sticky and black in the pale light. In the center of the hall lay the body of a creature so monstrous it barely looked real. A goblin, twisted and grotesque, its massive form slashed to ribbons. But the boy wasn't alone. All around him, the cats he had drawn the night before were staring at him, their mouths dripping with blood. Their eyes glowed unnaturally, and their claws were sharp and wet. The boy stumbled out of the temple, too terrified to look back. He finally understood the priest's warning. The cats had protected him, but they were not his friends. They were something else, something ancient and dangerous. And kid, Grandpa said, his voice dropping to a whisper, they say those cats are still out there, guarding that temple. And if you draw them, if you wake them, you'd better stick to small places at night. Then he leaned back in his chair, leaving me staring into the fire, every creak of the house behind me suddenly sounding like a growl. A long time ago, in a quiet village, shrouded in mist and shadow, there lived a poor man named Kazuo. He was a humble woodcutter, known for his honesty but cursed with misfortune. No matter how hard he worked, his life remained a series of struggles. The villagers pitied him, yet their pity brought no relief to his empty table. One cold evening, Kazuo wandered deep into the woods. The sun had sunk below the horizon, and the trees seemed to close in around him. In the eerie silence, he noticed a faint flicker of light ahead. Curious and desperate, he followed it until he reached a clearing where an old man sat by a fire, wrapped in a tattered gray robe. The man looked up as Kazuo approached. His eyes, dark and endless, seemed to pierce through Kazuo's soul. "You seem troubled, young man," the stranger said, his voice calm yet unnervingly hollow. Kazuo hesitated but nodded. "I am cursed with poverty," he admitted. "No matter how hard I toil, I cannot change my fate." The old man smiled faintly. "Fate is a tricky thing," he said, "but what if I told you I could offer you a way to change it?" Kazuo leaned closer, intrigued. "How?" The stranger's smile widened, revealing unnaturally sharp teeth. "I am a Shinigami, a god of death," he said. "I will grant you the power to see me. When someone is near death, you will see me standing by their bedside. If I stand at the head of the bed, you may intervene and save them. But if I stand at their feet, Their time has come, and nothing you do can change that. Kazuo was skeptical. And why would you give me such power? The Shinigami's expression darkened. Because it amuses me to see how mortals tamper with destiny, he said. But heed this warning. Never try to cheat me. If you do, there will be consequences. Kazuo agreed, and the Shinigami vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of burning wood. At first, Kazuo used his new power cautiously. When someone in the village fell ill, he would visit their bedside. If he saw the Shinigami standing at the head of the bed, he would use simple remedies to save them. Word spread quickly, and soon Kazuo was hailed as a miracle worker. The villagers, who once pitied him, now revered him. They brought him gifts of food and coins, grateful for his help. For the first time in his life, Kazuo felt the warmth of prosperity. But with fame came temptation. One day, a wealthy merchant from a neighboring town came to Kazuo, begging him to save his dying son. When Kazuo arrived, he saw the Shinigami standing at the foot of the boy's bed. "There's nothing I can do," Kazuo said, his voice heavy with regret. The merchant, desperate, offered him a bag of gold. "I'll pay you double if you save my son," he pleaded. Kazuo hesitated. The Shinigami's warning echoed in his mind, but the lure of gold was too strong. He ordered the merchant to turn the bed around, making it appear as though the Shinigami stood at the head. Then he performed a simple ritual, and miraculously, the boy awoke. The merchant showered Kazuo with gold, and Kazuo convinced himself that no harm had been done. That night, the Shinigami appeared in Kazuo's home. His form was darker, more menacing than before. "You disobeyed me," the Shinigami said, his voice like the crackle of fire. Kazuo tried to explain. "I only wanted to help the boy. Surely you can forgive one mistake." The Shinigami's eyes glowed with fury. "You have upset the balance of life and death," he said. "There is a price for such arrogance. Consider this your only warning." The Shinigami vanished, leaving Kazuo trembling in the dark. Despite the warning, Kazuo continued to cheat death. Each time he turned a bed around, the Shinigami's anger grew. But Kazuo was blinded by his growing wealth and fame. Then one day, Kazuo received a summons from a powerful lord whose wife was gravely ill. The lord offered him a fortune beyond his wildest dreams. When Kazuo arrived, he saw the Shinigami standing at the foot of her bed. This time, Kazuo hesitated. The Shinigami's warnings haunted him, but the lord's gold was too tempting to resist. Kazuo ordered the servants to turn the bed around. As he performed the ritual, he felt an icy chill creep up his spine. The woman gasped and opened her eyes, but the room seemed darker, as though a shadow had fallen over it. Kazuo returned home that night, uneasy but determined to put the incident behind him. The next morning, Kazuo awoke to find the Shinigami standing at the foot of his own bed. "Is it my time?" Kazuo whispered, his voice trembling. The Shinigami smiled grimly. "Not yet," he said, "but soon. You've cheated me too many times, and now you must face the consequences." Terrified, Kazuo begged for mercy. "Please, I'll do anything to make amends." The Shinigami considered this. "Very well," he said. "I'll give you one chance to save yourself. But you must use the power I gave you wisely. If you fail, your soul will belong to me." Kazuo agreed, desperate to escape his fate. The Shinigami sent Kazuo to a nearby village, where a deadly plague had broken out. Many were dying, and Kazuo saw the Shinigami standing at nearly every bedside. He worked tirelessly, saving those he could. But as the days passed, he noticed something strange. Each time he saved someone, another fell ill. The more he interfered, the worse the plague seemed to spread. One night, Kazuo came across a young girl on the brink of death. The Shinigami stood at the head of her bed, but his expression was different this time, almost sorrowful. Kazuo hesitated. He could save her, but what would it cost? He looked into the Shinigami's eyes and finally understood. His interference had caused the plague to worsen. By saving one life, he had doomed many others. Tears streaming down his face, Kazuo stepped back and let the girl's fate take its course. When the plague finally subsided, the Shinigami appeared before Kazuo. "You've learned your lesson," the Shinigami said. "Fate cannot be cheated, and every life saved comes at a cost." Kazuo nodded, his heart heavy with guilt. "What happens now?" he asked. The Shinigami's smile returned, but this time it was almost kind. "Your debt is paid," he said. "But remember this, your gift was not a blessing, but a curse. Use it wisely, or you may find yourself standing at the foot of your own bed once more." With that, the Shinigami vanished, leaving Kazuo to ponder the fragile balance of life and death. From that day on, he used his power sparingly, knowing that every choice had consequences far greater than he could imagine. But the shadows of his past mistakes lingered, and on quiet nights, Kazuo could still feel the Shinigami's cold gaze watching him, waiting for the day he might falter again. Years later, on his deathbed, Kazuo smiled as he saw the Shinigami standing at the foot of his bed. "I'm ready," he said. But the Shinigami didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his form shifting into something darker, more monstrous. "You misunderstood," the Shinigami said, his voice now a growl. "You paid your debt, but your soul was always mine. I warned you about the price of cheating death." As Kazuo's final breath left his body, the Shinigami's shadow consumed him, dragging his soul into the abyss, where all those who defy death are doomed to wander for eternity. And so, the once great healer became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one, not even the cleverest among us, can escape the grip of the Shinigami.